moment to get, please feel free to turn on your cameras. The hope is that we can really treat this as a gathering, especially across UCs. Do keep your sound off. We are recording, just to let everyone know, so hopefully people are okay with that, and please know that if you do turn your camera on. But really good to see everyone. My name is Amelia Glazer. I'm a professor of literature at UC San Diego. I also am the director of our Institute for Arts and Humanities. And as part of our institute, we like to put together Zoom events for faculty, colleagues across the UCs. And this year we have a theme which is considering translation. So I'm really, really grateful to Mark Hauber of the Center for Art and Translation, Cindy Oak of UC Irvine, and Giancarlo Tursi for being part of the panel. And I'll keep my introduction fairly short. Mark Hauber is the program director at the Center for Art and Translation's Poetry Inside Out program. This is a program that works on teaching students, mostly K-12, the art of literary translation, mostly through poetry. And I've had a relationship with this program since Mark's predecessor, which was like 16 years ago, Marty Rutherford. When I was an assistant professor here at UC San Diego, I wanted to place some of my undergraduate students in local schools to teach translation. I had this crazy idea that I thought was plucked from nowhere. And one of my graduate students at the time, Jadine Pluker, I don't know if Jadine is on the call, but Jadine suggested that I should really look at the Center for Art and Translation, which already has such a program. And I reached out to Marty, who then actually came down to UCSD and helped to train that first generation of students a long time ago. And the reason for starting such a program is that I had begun teaching translation within the context of literary theory classes, and I realized that there were students who really engaged with literary theory deeply when they applied it to translate, had some kind of deep interaction or relationship to a language other than English, who really understood languages. And I had this fantasy that I wanted to get to my undergrads earlier, ideally when they were still in elementary school. And it was just a kind of remarkable case of stars aligning that the Center for Art and Translation already had developed a curriculum, and not only that, but they were willing to be incredibly generous and share their curriculum with me, which I've used now, not only with my students going out and teaching in the local public schools, but also with students here at UC San Diego. We had a bit of a hiatus with the internship program, but we just restarted it. And Mark is actually here with me, sitting across from me, training a group of 20 students who will be going into classrooms in February in San Diego to do something similar. They'll be getting UCSD class credit to teach translation to grades roughly 3 through 7. So that's kind of just a little bit of background on my relationship as a UC faculty member with the Center for Art and Translation, and it's been really fortuitous for me over the years. Giancarlo Tursi is a professor of French and Italian at UC Santa Barbara, but he's also a co-advisor of the Translation Studies program at UCSB. He's been teaching a creative writing course in translation studies. And I'm really grateful that he is one of our respondents to Mark's presentation today. Our other respondent is Professor Cindy Oak, who is a professor at UC Irvine. Cindy actually also spent some time at UC San Diego as a visiting professor a few years ago. She, among other things, is the author of Word Toward, which came out with the Yale series of younger poets. And she is about to release a book of translations, The Hell of That Star, by Kim Hye-sun from Wesleyan University Press. And I understand that that's coming out momentarily. And we were just speaking, and Cindy is also working on starting a translation minor at UC Irvine. So I hope that this conversation can blend into possibilities of working with translation across UC campuses. So I'll go ahead and turn over the floor to Mark, who will talk about the PIO program, the Poetry Inside Out program, and then Cindy and Giancarlo will both open up the floor with a few questions for Mark, and I'm hoping that other people on this call will join.
So thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who is attending today. For your time and your attention. It's greatly appreciated. So I am the program director for Poetry Inside Out, which is a program at the Center for the Art of Translation based in San Francisco. Uh, in addition to my program, we have a small press and a public programs offering. And I highly encourage you to go to our website. There'll be a QR code in the beginning of the slide deck that I'll show in a couple of minutes. If you want to scan that QR code, that'll take you not only to that'll take you to our link tree where you can download our program guide. So if you have further questions about Poetry Inside Out, but also we'll have a link to the center's site where you can look at more of our program offerings, at the center. Just a little history. So Poetry Inside Out was, I'll say, conceived in the year 2000 by our founder, Olivia Sears, and a educator at Oakland Unified School District, um, Michael Ray. And in essence, Michael, who is also a poet and a translator himself, kind of came to this aha moment that what he was doing, the way he was engaging with language as he translated poetry, um, was exactly what he wanted his students to be able to do. He wanted them to have that sort of engagement with language. And he approached Olivia, who had also been at the same time thinking about ways that they could develop some educational offerings at the center. And together they kind of constructed the first iteration of Poetry Inside Out, which was originally a language instruction program solely in Spanish. And so since then, it's evolved, obviously, and that evolution has taken place. I use this somewhat strange analogy of, that Olivia and Michael placed this large ball of clay on a potter's wheel, and over the years, many people have sat at that wheel and given shape. Their hands and their attention has given shape to this vessel that we now call Poetry Inside Out. So, and and I consider anybody who has been implementing PO or anybody that has, any attention or has taken it into the world themselves to be people sitting at that wheel as well. So, going forward, I encourage you to reach out to me if there are any questions, concerns, or if you have your own insights. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to run through sort of a little more of an introduction to the program and then its workings. So as I had said, if you want to take a moment and just scan that QR code, that'll take you to our link tree, which will give you some more information about PO, about the center, an option to sign up for our mailing list if you feel so inclined. But then also too, you'll have access to the program's guide, which will offer further insights into the program. So, what makes Poetry Inside Out unique? There's a number of different sort of factors that make it unique. One, the program treats translation as close reading. The fusion of translation and poetry in particular, taking sort of one of the most densest forms of language and blending it uh, with the closest reading you can do of any given text, which is translation. Also, bridges cultures through language. So, one of the other aspects about Poetry Inside Out is that it is a dialogic and collaborative endeavor and curricula. So, having students engage with a text via translation and doing so collaboratively with their classmates allows students to not only experience the full force of another's linguistic and cultural heritage, but for them to engage their own and use that to really collaborate with others and in this act of collaborative translation. And then obviously build skills through collaboration. So those things sort of generative dialogue, uh, critical thinking, um, and in those aspects. So what do students gain through PO? What we've found that is students who participate in the arts, uh, and many studies have shown this, do better in school, are more engaged with teachers and fellow students, and are more confident and able to express their ideas. So through Poetry Inside Out, we've found students develop a deeper understanding how a language works. through this deep engagement with not only language as a text and on paper, but their own language and the language of their fellow classmates. An appreciation for world literature and diverse cultures, excuse me. So I like to think that in addition to sort of developing this sort of cultural competency, there is definitely a cultural empathetic muscle that gets developed by students engaging again with the written text, but also with each other. And then confidence in their own linguistic and cultural knowledge, and skills in critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. And a recognition that they can accomplish something meaningful and challenging. So I'm going to show a video. I need to, yeah, so I need to go, excuse me 1 second. I need to duck out and turn off my mic then, I guess. Yeah.
You want to still have that slide.
Yeah, can you see it?
No.
Can't, okay.
Yeah, I would just leave the slide and then have our original audio.
Sorry.
We're sitting across the table from each other. So. Slideshow by committee.
Tôi hỏi nước, nước sống với nước, như thế nào?
古池や買わず飛び込む水の音。
Silly, yam pool, yam zone, yam ditch.
Would like
I don't know.
I would like to go with desires food. What about you guys?
No, why? I think you could. I think you saw it like it's some words after and some says oh there's two lands there. Same land. How do you live They're the best. That's like saying. That's like saying. Okay. So good. I'm gonna say now. That's okay. So if that would be like that, it would be like saying man or woman. How do you? But in this question, women put on their man.
Ancient lagoon, fascinating. Love bridges and disappears into water.
Look at this ancient pond. Frog plunges. Water's full.
Man, I think that the whole meant that even a sunset can be a beautiful thing. A energy of just taking a book and drawing or taking a picture to remember that beautiful nature moment. And I drew a picture. I think Basho wrote his poem so we would appreciate the little things in life because they're not going to be here forever. Like the frog in its gracefulness.
Question. I question the earth. How does the earth live with itself? We admire each other.
I ask grass. In which way does grass live with grass? We weave together to create the horizon. I ask people, in which way do people live with people? I ask people, in which way do people live with people? I ask people, in which way do people live with people? I think that people like it's saying that how everything else can get along so well, the grass, the water, and the land, but why can't people get along?
So what did you hear in the photo that you said that?
Because when it's asking the question to the land, the water, and the grass, there's a response. Like we weave together to create the horizon, but in people, there's no response. When I knew that my grandmother passed away, I was very sad. But now that I write it, I feel like if I express it, I don't have to like say it in my mind and start to get sad. I just can say it in a piece of writing. It's September 28th. September 28th, an unexpected day. My family in pain. She is sick. It's a stormy night. I'm in a cage, unable to get to her. I'm confused with nothing to think about. There's a wall. I want to climb it to get to her. 11 o'clock, she's gone. I felt her pain. I was dying as well. I'm living a nightmare. I know you know her. I love her, and she loves me. She's my grandmother. And so the Batman. And so it's not there. And it's power. That's the only time.
So obviously the class you just saw was in Worcester, Massachusetts. One of the things that we realized as we sort of put PO out into the world was that if we had sort of kind of done a Johnny kind of Appleseed approach, we experienced a lot of different like mutations, if you will, of the program and its offerings and its scaffolded pieces of it. So we came up with a sort of sense of key practices and fundamentals that drive the program. And the thinking being that as long as you're sort of engaged with these key practices and these fundamentals and adhere to sort of what the power that sort of drives this program, you're doing PO. And what this allows people to do, practitioners, is to take PO and bring it into their own classrooms and kind of tailor it to meet their needs. So even though PO is, for the most part, implemented in, I would say, fourth through 12th grade classrooms, the program is also suited for and has been used widely in post-secondary settings for everything from poetic analysis to creative writing, and even been used in history classes and in some cases, science classes. The thinking being at that point, then, one of the things that I think we found also with this program is that once kids, so as students or anybody who's participating in it, it opens up and sort of creates this culture of inquiry that practitioners and students, those participating, really gain that skill of what does it mean to sort of ask questions of a text and ask questions of each other, and then use that information, obviously, to increase their own knowledge and then come back and ask further questions. And once that sort of lens has been developed, it can be really turned on just about anything. So the key practices that guide the program, one is obviously reading aloud. So this idea of going public with your translations, with your observations, with your own original work, with your thinkings, and a focus on depth over breadth. So this idea that this process takes time, and rushing through a translation or rushing to get to an endpoint actually cheapens or sort of say sells short the practice itself. So taking the time to allow questions to occur, for tangents to be explored and questions to be answered is key to this practice. and an engagement with the work. And of course, before I had mentioned before this idea of sort of we treat poetry, the translation of poetry, as the sort of closest form of reading you can do. But again, engagement with the work, comes in many, many fashions. But again, getting back to the sort of idea of a focus of depth over a breadth, that is what allows for a deep engagement with the work on multiple levels. And then the time and the ability to present and defend work. So not only translations, original work, thoughts, ponderings, answers to questions that have been generated, and then a repetition. So once one's translation has been sort of completed, the idea is to scaffold that and build upon the next, moving increasingly in, I will say, difficulty or challenge as you kind of go through the process. So the idea starting with something that's generative, that is full of meaning and ambiguity to sort of generate conversations. I use Basho's frog haiku as an example, and then moving up through complexity to poems that are a little bit more challenging because of their devices that are employed, the language that is being translated, the topics that are being addressed. And in this category, I would refer to poems like those off the walls of the detention center in Angel Island. And we provide a scaffolding tool for all of those participating teachers through what we refer to as the teacher's toolbox, which is the kind of on the center site where we house all the curricula. We've scaffolded our poem page offerings, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So the fundamentals of the program: first, obviously, translation and translating poetry in particular. Collaboration. This is not an activity that is done in isolation. Talking and listening. So in this program, obviously, and in this approach, you're engaged in a dialogic process and in a dialogic environment. So the idea is allowing time and space for people to talk and to listen. And not only talk and listen, but talk and listen in a certain fashion. And then what activates the power of PO? First is a classroom culture that's characterized by a productive talk and a critical dialogic pedagogy. So this talk moves as tools. So ideas like, can you say more? I'm curious about what you think. Why do you think that? Things of those natures. And these are sort of key phrases. And this idea, these talk moves are not necessarily, or I should say, not something that only is employed by the teacher, but are employed by the students as well. Special listening. So this is a term that was conceived by actually students in Worcester, Massachusetts, a collection of four high school students who had done their own research actually into their own practice within this program. And they came up with this idea that when I said before about sort of listening, but listening in a particular and talking in a particular fashion, this is what I meant. What they said, that more than listening with one's ears, that is taking in what someone else is saying. It means listening with eyes, ears, mind, one's history, one's own culture, languages, and actively and interactively trying to see what's behind what that person is saying, is what we refer to as special listening. And I think this is obviously also very important because the individuals who conceived this were, again, high school students who were engaged and who were participating in the program. It also goes back a little bit to what I was saying before about this idea of people sitting at this potter's wheel. It's not just obviously the people who have conceived this program or administrators or teachers or faculty members in various universities. It's everybody. It's teachers in classrooms. It's students who participate in this. It is everybody who's on this call right now. All of those energies, thoughts, ideas go into this process and enrich it. Relational practices and storytelling. So norms, openings, closing, appreciations, stories and storytelling and connections. So those are sort of the things. So the main piece of the program, and I apologize for rushing through this so quickly, but the main piece of the program is the scaffolded tool that we employ, and that's what we call the poem page. So the poem page consists of all essential materials that are necessary for a translation. And each poem that is part of the Poetry Inside Out curriculum consists of a dedicated set of pages. So within the curriculum and in the teacher's toolbox I was referring to earlier, we currently have about 76 different pages. So that's 76 different poems in covering approximately 20 some odd or more actually languages. But each poem page has the poem in its original language, a portrait of the poet or an image related to the poem, a brief bio of the poet. Something I didn't add to this too is you'll see if you look at Basho's name underneath, we'll put the country of origin. So where was this individual from? The date of his lifespan or her lifespan, and then the language that the poem is written in, or the language that the poet primarily composes in. So all of this is meant to give context. So all of this is meant to provide information to the student and to the class that deepens the translation process. So the bio, when it's developed, is done so in a way to augment and highlight specific areas of not only the poet's life that are relevant, but also the poem itself. And then we have the translator's glossary. So the translator's glossary has the word in its originating language. So if it's a character-based language, another column is added that has the romanization. And we have the definition of the word as it is used in the poem, and a set of possible or suggested synonyms. And again, this is another indication of sort of a participation of everybody. I told the story yesterday. It used to just say synonyms, and we had a student in, I think it was Philadelphia, San Francisco, who had said to me, this is completely incorrect. He said, this is synonyms. He's like, there are other words. He's like, I speak this language. There are words that fit better in this translation than what you have given us. And I said, well, you should use that. And then he said, you should change this to possible synonyms because this is misleading. And we did. So, and then we have the phrase by phrase work page and the make it flow work page. And I'll get into that in a second. These are employed in what we call, and we have the defending and finding meaning workbook page. So this final page is a conversation starter. Some teachers employ it. Other teachers kind of construct their own questions based on whatever, based on why they're actually employing PO. One of the things that is not covered in this that I'll talk about let me go back really quickly here. In this phrase by phrase and make it flow workbook page. So students, when they are translating poems, go through 4 different phases. The 2 most important being this phrase by phrase translation and the make it flow. So in the phrase by phrase, they're working in pairs. And what they're doing in pairs is they're coming up with an agreed upon phrase by phrase translation. So at this point, the translation is in its basically first draft. So in a case like Basho's, or actually any translation for that matter, this is going to be something that may be a little wonky, doesn't necessarily make sense, and that is fine. And then what happens in the next phase is those pairs come back together into a group of 4, and they do what we call make it flow. And in the make it flow stage, this is where they're asking questions about form, about sound, about syntax. So for example, in this case, are we going to stick with the syllabication rules of haiku? Are we going to throw that out the window and stick with something else? What are the relevant aspects of this poem that need to be kept? What can we get rid of and keep in order for it to be the translation that we like? And then they come up with a single agreed upon make it flow translation. Now, this entire process takes more than one class session, a class session in being 50 minutes long. And the idea, again, goes back to what I was saying before about this idea of a depth over breadth approach. So you want to allow enough time for even before the translation process begins for there to be questions asked about the poet. Who are they? Where did they come from? What do we know about this individual? What do we know about this individual's life? All of those things. And I always encourage teachers that so I kind of talk about it as being sort of setting the table. And the more work you can put in that area, the deeper the rest of the experience is for students.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to turn the floor over to Giancarlo and Cindy to offer some responses and to kick off a bigger discussion. Once they've had a chance to engage a little bit, maybe we'll have each of them offer some questions one at a time, and then Mark, you can respond to those, and then we can open it up to a bigger conversation. We hadn't determined an order. Would one of you really like to go first? Cindy, do you want to just jump in? Go ahead.
Sure, yeah. I loved the video. That was so lovely. It was so sweet and interesting. And I think that the collaborative element of the program is so important to get students feeling critical of the reverence that we sometimes teach, especially in K through 12, of the written word, that there's like a finality and that there's a right answer and that what it says in the book is correct and we memorize it, right? Especially in certain kinds of educational models. And so kind of breaking that down, having students participate with it, interact with it, and change that finality or feel the tentacles of the words and their politic and their the riddle aspect that came up in the presentation is so important. And so in the video, when there's that scene where there's a kind of bristling, I thought that's really the spirit of translation. This feeling of like, "Oh, I want to explain it this way," or like, "Oh, but are you seeing this aspect?" or "What have we considered this?" And there being like this fun disagreement and all these different kind of examples, explanations coming in, reaching across the table. I really think of that as such a feeling of translation and being a translator and engaging with translators of like the way that we interact when we are kind of working in the same direction between languages. There can be like a frustration. There can be like a a lively sort of feeling of building together and also making different choices. But yeah, and then the Kevin too. I think Kevin Arevalo, it was this idea of what can be held on the page and what can kind of go onto the page and then be a container and also be something alive for the students. So there was so much focus on collaborating, interacting, literature and life as not separate from each other, but something that interact and are a part of each other's kind of existence and possibility. It was so relational and there was a lot of excitement. And I think that it's important not to lose what is alive in those younger classrooms, in our classrooms too, is to have that kind of interactive feeling and also to keep moving that toolbox of the poem pages and making them wider and making them wilder and bringing in what is the open loop of that language or of that poem. But I think what makes poetry really exciting too is that we often do have line breaks. And so there's a lot to discuss about how that works, especially the example was Japanese. Sometimes that has a very different sentence structure than English. And so you have to kind of decide, well, what's important, the order of the words or the way that the sentence sounds overall, right? The order of the kind of information or of the keywords. But I think that one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about is how students can feel valued not only for what language they might have outside of the classroom language and what they can bring, the special, listening and talking they can do from that, but also about how much they're able to learn about a language just from this activity, right? Like what kinds of things become obvious to them, what kinds of things feel alive to them. I have an activity I love, which is just bringing in 4 translations of the same poem. So of course it has to be kind of, somebody that, Kavafi or Darwish, like someone who's translated a lot. And then that's it. We just discuss these translations. And there's so much that students are sort of, figuring out, like using that to calculate about the original poem and the choices that a translator makes and the style that a writer inevitably has to kind of establish consciously or unconsciously. But I think that the program seems to really value how to make conscious the work that students are already doing and how to have those conversations be more explicit so that students can feel that they're that they're more aware, but also that it's valued and that it's shared. Um, and yeah, it's a really exciting thing to think about how a student who's introduced to these models and to these kinds of questions early on can start to ask themselves those questions and can start to ask others those questions and then can always see every page as alive and up for discussion, up for kind of wrestling with. And I think that kind of interaction and that sense that things are not necessarily stable um, in the way that sometimes we imagine of text as separate from us and separate from life, can be really generative and not just in their study of literature, but in their in their life of learning. Yeah.
Yeah, Cindy, it's interesting. You'd mentioned the activity that you like to do. One of the ones that I like to I do a similar one with actually with Basho's frog haiku, particularly with students who are sort of just recently kind of new to this process and new to translation. One question that's frequently asked of me, I think possibly more than one person in this call has had the same experience, which is, you know, after everybody's done translating, somebody asks, "Well, can I see the answer now?" You know, they want to see the correct one. There's a seminal translation that they're all shooting for. And, it's interesting because that's also something that students, some particularly are, they want to know, did I get this right? Am I going to get an A on this? And so deconstructing that a little bit, I think is a positive thing. But one of the things I do with the frog haiku too is, again, been translated thousands of times by many different individuals and putting up 3 or 4 different translations that are all completely different. I was we were talking yesterday, and I was saying, if you take a look at I think Alan Watts's and uh, yeah, and Ginsberg's, and they're just completely different, but they're all valid translations. And so this idea of what is a valid translation, and what you know, so the through lines in all of it, most students will come up with. Well, there's an amphibian, there's a sound and an action, and a body of water of some sort in all of these translations. And they start sort of thinking about things different. But I think it also gives some validity to their own translation and to their own perspective because it's not this sort of like, well, that's incorrect, or, that's not, or even too, you can address this issues, questions around, you know, um, you know, the validity of a translation and what do we owe to the original poet.
Yeah, there's this great study, the hidden curriculum study from the early 80s, I think, where students in these, I think it was New Jersey classrooms, would respond really differently to the question of, what knowledge is and how we learn based on class.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the like, middle class classrooms, it was like the teachers, we listen to the teachers and whatever they say must be right, or, the books. And then in the upper class schools, there were 2 different models. And one was, knowledge is out there. I have to go get it. I have to go find the right answer. And then one was, I make knowledge, and it's really interesting, like these different models of like the right answer, especially when it comes to these kind of generative arts, because I think that it can be a trained way that that school becomes a way to kind of access either the mode of learning and the mode of making, or this sense that things are just checked up against whatever's in some answer book. So yeah, I think that question really tells us a lot, and it's not a wrong question. It's a really interesting question that can help to drive a better understanding of how to expand the question of translation too. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for
Yeah.
sharing.
And one's own thinking as well, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna turn to Giancarlo and then
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so kind of piggybacking on this conversation about collaboration, which I also found super interesting, and thinking about ways in which one might implement that in higher education, because I do think it's definitely this model is definitely translatable, if you will, in other formats. And it seems so. I guess I have a question on methodology because it seems like what permits this collaboration is the fact that you have this workbook and that students are working from like predetermined texts. They're not bringing their own text, and they don't necessarily speak the language of the original text. And so with the aid of this glossary, they're able to have this great collaboration, which is, I think, a fantastic idea. One doesn't need to have access to the original to translate, or rather, it opens up so many doors. I'm just wondering, yeah, how one might implement that in a case where, in the translation workshop that I teach, I ask students to bring in their own work, right? And students come from different backgrounds, different linguistic backgrounds. In some cases, obviously, some languages will have overlap. And so I think basically I'm just kind of brainstorming because I feel like I want to introduce collaboration more into how I do it. Because usually, you know, the collaborative aspect comes at the end where they share their works, but not in the process stage. And I find that really interesting. So I'm trying to kind of think about, and yeah, I was really taken by that moment that we saw in the video where they're kind of, tugging at the sentences, bristling a little bit. Um, so yeah, wondering how one might implement that in a different context where one doesn't have these predetermined translations and deal with the question of, the diversity of languages that students bring where there isn't always overlap. Yeah.
So that's a great question. So, well, one fashion is, one of the other things that I do and Amelia's doing with her students is have them construct their own poem pages. So we provide a template and kind of brief instructions on sort of how to do that, if you will. And we found that if students are doing that, so one of the things, going back to the video that we saw, you saw the one student who had wrote a poem about the passing of his grandmother. And on the back on the screen, I don't know if you could make it out, was projected his poem page of his poem. And so he constructed his own poem page with his own bio that he felt things people needed to know about him and his grandmother that was relevant, and then constructed a translator's glossary. In his case, it was English into Spanish. But we've had other classes where people have gone Spanish into English or Spanish into other languages and found that those students that are constructing their own, and even instructors who are constructing their own, if let's say there's a poem or a language that isn't contained within the library of our offerings, obviously they're engaging with the text and engaging with language on a different level in a different way, but it is equally empowering, and I think deepens one's understanding of the process to do that. So if you have translated and then go back and then construct your own.
Can I just add that, I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about how amazing that would be in like a multilingual writing class to have people not demand, but offer the opportunity for their classmates to translate their poem that they are writing as part of the writing class or other piece of writing.
Yeah, and to have the poem page be part of the process, to be like
Right.
have the poem page be part of the work in progress, I think is really interesting, so that the collaboration happens as one is doing the translation, and not, or like the reflection on, all those reflections on what's lost and whatnot. It can kind of happen as one is working and not at the end as a sort of like a summary of that. Yeah.
Yeah, constructing a scaffolded tool that is ultimately what's going to be used for somebody else to engage with your own individual work or the work of
Because
a
then
work
one can get feedback on, even if other students don't have knowledge of that language, translating the difficulties that you're having translating this poem. And you have different possible synonyms. Another access to that language can weigh in on the flow of it, the choices, yeah, and kind of work interlingually, yeah.
I'll throw in that I've actually used poem pages. There were a few poem pages that Marty Rutherford had given me many years ago I've used them at undergraduate level, I've used them at graduate level, and these were sometimes poem pages that were constructed for third graders. I don't necessarily do the worksheet part, but these are just useful tools for giving people like a box of crayons and saying, create. Um, and obviously there are different things you can do with it if you're an adult who has studied languages and so forth. But I also use them for my Russian literature classes if I'm teaching like a class full of non-Russian speakers. I will sometimes do something like a poem page for a Russian poem with a glossary, where I make people who don't know the language engage with the language a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll add too, just as a sort of side note, too, if you would go back to the key practices and the fundamentals, the idea is that if you're engaged and you're following, sticking to the fundamentals and the key practices and adhering to, or at least, thinking from what, the powers that, the gauge it, sort of seeing things from a resource as opposed to a deficit-based model, you're doing PO. So when it comes to manipulating or when it comes to tailoring pieces of, like the poem pages, for example, to meet your needs, having students construct their own, going from, one language to another, let's say going from Russian to Spanish, if that was something that you were interested in doing, that is an open, you can do that.
I think also I imagine that the poem pages are this incredible tool, but also made to be resisted too, made to be expanded, made to be kind of rewired. And so, especially at these, different in these different contexts where maybe students have more access to the original language, there's a way that it's a base or it's something to kind of launch from. And to collaborate with. And I love that Giancarlo brought up the collaboration because it's such an important part of the program. But I think one thing we haven't touched on is like the collaboration with the author too, like that you're making something with the author and then and that's how it starts. And then you're also making something for the audience, right? Like the presentation aspect or publishing aspect, there's a collaboration with the reader in the new language.
Yeah. And that's the purpose of the bio, in one level. But then I also, one of the things that we also talk about a lot is, I spoke with Amelia's class yesterday about is this idea of like, I always call it table setting, which is bringing in sort of those, pieces of information that we may, that we need or want, or what do we know about this person? And I think it gets back, Cindy, what you were talking about, this conversation with the poet. And what can we learn about him? What do we know about this person? He or she or they. And so like Angel Island work, it's an anonymous individual. I dropped off for a second. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I wasn't sure if it was me. I was having trouble hearing.
I think it actually was
Maybe just
a known issue in our building this year. Overload.
okay.
But yeah, Giancarlo and Cindy, if you have another round of questions that you'd like to ask, maybe even getting into some nuts and bolts of accessing the PO resources, and then others, please feel free to jump in, either with a real hand or with a yellow hand with questions.
I have just maybe one last quick question that may or may not have a quick answer. But yeah, just wondering about your engagement or openness with like AI as like a tool or just, any kind of it's tricky, right? And I think at least one has to at least address it because one can think, oh, what's the point of translating in this age where translation, where AI can just do it for you?
Mm.
So even just talking about it or perhaps inviting it, if only to kind of subvert it, or I don't know. Yeah, I just think it's one of the discussions that's unfortunately unavoidable.
Is your question specifically about AI's relationship to poetry inside out, or
Whether, yeah, I guess no, but more specifically, whether you kind of encourage it or use it, in a
no?
way that can also be a tool. No, okay, yeah.
I do not encourage it. No, not at all. Um, I think that the act of translation is, among many, 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 many things, a very human endeavor. I think that the engagement with the text, uh, is a process that is, going back to what Cindy was saying about this sort of conversation with the individual, with the artist. And that is pen to paper work, and that is a collaborative endeavor that happens between human beings. And I do not think that there is a space in there. This is my personal belief that that is where it exists and on the human level. Um, I can't speak to AI on its an application outside. It's a tool like any other. But I think in the world of translation, it is a in a human endeavor. It's an engagement between humans, and that's the way it stands.
Yeah. And then perhaps that's what's there to remind us of is that sort of, that translation is more than just translation, that it implies so many other things. It involves really understanding, really interpreting something, really absorbing a text. Close reading, as you're saying, it's also a way of practicing close reading, right? So all those things are out the window.
Most definitely.
But I'm glad that you brought it up because as you asked it, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to say something about this in my translation seminar. It hadn't even occurred to me. But I think that one thing I've heard since it's a poetry focused program, I've never used it and I don't know how the apps work and stuff. But what I've been told by students and friends and things is that there's a problem with poetry that
How's it?
it's like impossible for it to like get it or to like see the music or or it's like everything's like a pantoum that's rhyming like it's hard for it to get into the heart of things and to kind of what Mark's talking about is like the maybe impossibility is related to
Yeah.
yeah.
It's one of the things I personally think that makes poetry as beautiful as it is it's the human elements, it's the ness, the NESS of it, and the human aspect. And you're only going to get that by engaging with the text deeply on your own with other people, um, and taking the time to do it and do it. I guess, yeah, got back to saying it's a human endeavor.
Ainsley has a hand up. Oh, Ainsley, you're muted.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought I would weigh in on this and say I think one of the really great things about the PO model, which is totally expandable to higher levels of education, but I think works kind of equally well at all the levels, is having people just start translating and have that experience and recognize that every single person in the group is going to come up with a different word and that is based on whatever life experience they are bringing at that particular moment, no matter how old they are. And so I think it's actually a really great way of demonstrating the limitations of AI. Like you can ask, you could, as an exercise, you could say, okay, AI, you become a group member, you give us your version, but it won't be any better and it will probably be worse in some ways than whatever people in the group might come up with.
Ainsley, I wanted to just jump in and say one thing I've done with students in the past is given them, it's not exactly a poetry page, but an assignment to do a machine translation of a poem. And I've done it with a stanza from Eugene Onegin and then have the student critique it.
Yeah.
Line by line, like talk about formal problems, talk about word choice, talk about tone. And that can be kind of a fun way of engaging because the students are out for blood, right? This is their future careers on the line. So they really want to take AI down.
Well, and you could do, I mean, you could have done that with Google Translate, right? Or like in that sense, like AI is just an aggregate of the various internet tools that we already had, right? Um,
Yeah. I'd love to hear if others have like ways that they've creatively integrated AI into translation classrooms. I don't know if
Well, I teach translation and interpreting here at UCSB. I teach Spanish translation and interpreting, and I teach technical translation and interpreting. So I understand that for you guys is it's very to translate poem, it's very different to translate technical translation. And artificial intelligence has been doing very well in terms of product and edition. So what most of translators are doing is they are using artificial intelligence and then they add it. At least in terms of technical translation, I work with professional translators. I test them actually, and they are doing it, and it's their life basically. So it is a reality, and that's why I use that in the classroom. And we gotta face it one way or another, and it's probably very different for you guys, literature. But honestly, that's the way we're all living in, and it doesn't affect only translation and interpreting, but it affects all of us. So it's something to know about, to read about, to get curious about as well. I think so. Because the students, they will ask and they will challenge us. Yeah.
It's
Thank
a
you.
good point.
Yeah.
I guess one thing I would add though too, I'm assuming technical translation covers sort of like manuals and things like
It could be anything. It could be a CNN page, web page about
oh, okay, so that
what is
would
happening
yeah,
in
journalism.
Venezuela right now. Yes.
Yeah, so I guess it's a broad definition then because some people would also call a news article, literature.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
taught news translation, so that was the title
Yeah.
of that specific course. But in all the classes, they do use artificial
Yeah.
intelligence. The
But so
students
for like an example of like a technical translation might be like medical information.
could be a
But in
report from the
fact,
doctor. Yeah.
yeah, but in fact, medical
Legal.
translators in hospitals translate a lot more than the medical information, right? Like there are ways that the language can be literal, and then there are ways that the language can also communicate something larger, or can take into account the kind of cultural meanings that allow for the information to be compared or engaged with or understood in a different way. And so there is a lot that people are doing that translate that are not literal or that are not technical, and that kind of require a creative understanding and the kind of empathy that students are building through the program too, or in classrooms like Amelia's and Giancarlo's, where they're having to think like, well, what does the writer think? What is the kind of feeling going on? And that can be true also for a patient or for someone in the doing the citizenship test, all these things.
I guess that would maybe, yeah, it's a very contentious debate that everyone's having, and then maybe to kind of strike the balance somewhat, maybe make the argument for the editing process that Aline described itself having a creative component, having the creative component that you're describing, Cindy. And yeah, for better or worse, I think I definitely agree that there are hard limits to what AI can do with literature in particular, but it is so much part of the age, and students are engaging with it. And so maybe I think admitting it is important because our intervention should be one of making critical use of it because they're going to do it anyway, in a sense. And so perhaps, yeah, not devaluing that. I mean, yeah, if you're just using it passively, copying and pasting it, but one can have a kind of dialogical relationship, as weird as that sounds, and as dystopian as that sounds, with, it's very much based on, the input you give it, the questions you ask it, and so on and so forth. And it's very moldable too. I mean, you can mold it to the point where you can get it to say nonsense. And so perhaps you could even like use it in a kind of like avant-garde-ish way. But you know, there as a tool, there is, I would argue, a creative use of it. But like any tool, there's also a huge danger behind it. So I think it's just one of the new frontiers that we have to face.
It may be that we need to have a future UC Humanities translation discussion dedicated to technology and uses of AI, since this is something we're all thinking about.
You could definitely fill an hour or more with that topic.
I want to thank Cindy, Giancarlo, Mark for being here. Really, really appreciate it, and all of you for coming. They all have agreed to, stick around on the Zoom for a few more minutes, just in case people have individual questions that they didn't want to ask during the recording. But I'll formally end things now. Thank you so much for coming. We'll go ahead and stop the recording. And then we can continue more privately if anyone wants.